The art of listening. In a world of instantaneous responses, it can be difficult for us to stop and choose to truly hear what other people have to say, especially when what they have to say goes against what we believe to be true. Today's guest, Jackie Gingrich Cushman, is an author, columnist, and speaker. She encourages civil disagreements with the means of finding common ground. Jackie is talking with Lenya and I about why America is broken and how we can fix it by looking at the example of Jesus and the examples written out in the Bible. Jackie shares about why expressing rage only leads to more rage and uses the example of Jesus' life to remind us that we are called to love our enemies, not excluding people who are loyal to a different political party. We are sharing ideas for how to communicate well with people that you may not always agree with. We are sharing practical ideas for how to communicate well with people that you may not always agree with, and why we must understand that hearing someone out does not mean that we are approving of their beliefs. I am so excited for you all to hear this conversation, so let's jump in. Welcome to All the Things, the unscripted podcast where we talk to intriguing people from a variety of cultures, backgrounds, and career paths and deconstruct who they are and why they think the way that they do. We dig deep and ask unexpected questions to learn about all the things, from faith and current events to relationships and mental health. We want to satisfy your craving for knowledge, true connection, and real conversation. This is Lenya Heitzig and Lindsey Maestas. Hey everyone, welcome back to the All the Things podcast. Today I am here with Lenya and our lovely guest, author, columnist, and speaker, Jackie Gingrich Cushman. How are you, Jackie?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on today.
We are excited to dive into your book. Lenya, do you want to share a little bit about how you and Jackie met?
Yeah, it was really great. Well, first of all, I saw her in the lobby of the hotel. I was in Nashville and she was moving quickly to get ready. And then I found out she was going to be one of the guests on the Huckabee show that I was honored to be on. So she was just absolutely delightful. And I found that we had so many similar tracks in our point of views. You know, I don't want to say politically, although that's true, but just some of the foibles and the problems in our society that are making politics more blood sport, for lack of a better way of acknowledging that. And then I think she just had a little bit of power of positive thinking in her background, and my dad had written a book about that. And so many of the things she was saying, I was just absolutely tracking with her. And so we exchanged information and kept kind of texted each other back and forth. And I was thrilled. She has this book, Our Broken America, Why Both Sides Need to Stop Ranting and Start Listening. And Jackie, I don't know how much I got to share with you, but my parents divorced young, and my dad and that side of the family are all Christians, and not because Christians have to be Republicans, but they are Republicans and they're conservative. Whereas my mom and that side of the family tend to be very liberal, Democrat, bordering on socialism, because my sister's husband was a college professor and she's a social worker. So our family has a divide on a myriad of topics. And so when I saw your book, I was like, oh my word, I need to read this to know how to talk to my mother and my sister and other family members and not have our conversations turn sideways. So that's a little of how we met.
I love it. Jackie, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this and what led you to write this book?
Absolutely. So I started this journey a while ago, and I've written some columns. I'm a columnist, a weekly columnist, and I've written some about how politics can be too personal versus it should be focused on policy and how we can work together. And the thing that really has informed me is in the last, I have a 20-year-old and 18-year-old. And so once the second child was born, I stepped back from corporate America, worked part-time, but also spent a lot of time working in our community in Atlanta, working with a lot of nonprofits on causes that I care about, working on homelessness and the environment. And financial literacy and early education. And what I found in that experience is that a lot of times people would meet me, we'd work together, we'd make progress on whatever cause that we were working on. And then when they found out who my father was, they would decide it would shock them because they couldn't figure out how they could both like someone and work with someone of that background. But also it made me realize that on both sides, all too often, we prejudge others and that we really need to learn how to work together. So I've really worked very hard, to try to reach and meet people on a personal basis so that even if they don't like necessarily what I say or what I think, that they might like me as a person.
Okay.
And I think
go ahead.
Yeah.
For our listeners who don't know, tell us a little bit about your father.
Yeah, I had written down here, growing up Gingrich.
Yeah.
What was that like?
I know. I've often asked about growing up Gingrich, and that too has kind of informed, my perspective of politics. Obviously, he started running for Congress when I was very young. We lived in rural Georgia, not in the big city, and the district was a very large rural district. So we spent a lot of time in the car, meeting people at strip malls or at diners.
Yeah.
I mean, it was at gas stations at a four-way stop, right?
Yeah.
So getting out and talking to people. And he lost the first 2 times that he ran.
For our audience, her dad's Newt Gingrich. If you don't know his first name, we've said Gingrich, but I don't know if we said Newt Gingrich. So anyway, go ahead.
Former Speaker of the House.
Thank you.
Often to be found on Fox News. And I remember when I was very young, after he lost, I went back to school, and one of the administrators in the school came up to me that first day and said, "I'm really glad your dad lost," which I'm sure he was, but I still can't figure out why he felt compelled to tell a small child that.
Right.
So I've always had this intersection of politics and personal, and I've had to learn because of the experiences I've had how to pull them apart. So that if someone, for instance, when my dad and my husband first met, I was kind of standing away from them because I wanted them to meet on their own terms. And 2 guys next to me were like, "Oh, there's Newt Gingrich. He abandoned his wife and children." Well, that's fake news. It's not true. I mean, he didn't abandon me. And so I went over to them and very nicely corrected them. And they were very nice and totally embarrassed and, understood that they had gotten bad information. So over my life, I've had to figure out how to deal with the situation. And that's informed a lot of the way I approach things.
Well, people form preconceived ideas, concepts of all kinds of different people. So one of the things I related to you, look, my dad is not Newt Gingrich, but I'm a pastor's wife. And so as you were sharing, because at first I didn't know you were related, and then you explained, I went, oh, and you said, I don't usually lead with that because it can be polarizing. And I said, well, I'm similar. I'm a pastor's wife of a mega church. And I find if I'm sitting on an airplane and people strike up a conversation, if they say, what do you do? And I lead with pastor's wife, then it's like silence, crickets, right? And so I usually lead with, oh, I'm an author or I teach and things like that so that the conversation will move to a place where they're not threatened. And then in the conversation, if I say pastor's wife, they haven't already, put me in a subcategory that I'm a vampire and they need garlic or something.
Right, exactly.
So I totally relate to what that feeling's like. And we kind of shared that idea as well. But I think what's beautiful about that, and at least what I've noticed in you, is you have developed these skills to be diplomatic and skills to be able to listen and reason with both sides. And I have found, I don't know if you have found, if I am genuinely trying to understand the other person or understand their perspective, with almost this, help me understand, explain this to me. I'm really unfamiliar, that it really kind of starts building this bridge instead of jumping into the polarized tug of war. If I jump in and say, help me understand that.
I think you're absolutely right, because what that does is a couple of things. One is it opens up your mind, right, to learn, right? So you don't already have your opinion. You're not going to listen at all. It also shows that you respect the other person, and I think a lot of our problem in politics today is the lack of respect of the other person. This is not about necessarily agreeing with all of their ideas or their policies, but it's just being respectful to them as a person. And I talk about that a lot in Our Broken America, because from my perspective, I believe that God made everybody, and that means
Amen.
that no one person, right? That no one person is better than the other person, right?
Yes.
And therefore, we should treat each other with respect. Because how can you not treat someone who was created by God with respect? So that's kind of where I start from in Our Broken America, about how do we think about treating everyone with the respect they deserve.
Well, and if you look at it biblically, it says love one another constantly in Scripture. But then it also tells us to love our enemies. So it's not like love the people who are like you, love the people in the same demographic, socioeconomic, or, don't love everybody that's like you, love everyone. And even if you perceive them as an enemy, love them. And so it's really pretty much a high call for a Christian to be that type of person. So in case you're in the audience and you think it's okay that I segregate a certain people group and that I can have antipathy toward them just because, for me, I was raised, my husband's been to Israel probably 70 times. I don't know. And I'm probably in my high 40s. So I really love the nation of Israel. And I'm really pleased with trying to make peace with Netanyahu, with having the capital in Jerusalem, or our embassy. So I'm thrilled with those kind of ideas, but that can make it seem like because I'm pro-Israel, I'm anti-Palestinian or I'm anti-Muslim. And so people kind of put these demarcations that we're forced to either or, not both end. And if you come in and you're saying, look, I'm not trying to make an either or, I'm at a both and stance, it's just not, there's not much tolerance in society for that. So, what I was on Huckabee with you is that I do this thing called Reload Love, and we help kids impacted by terror. So we're always in the equation of somebody not respecting, honoring, whatever, another people group. So because I have been so much in Israel, and a lot of terrorism happens in the Middle East, but it happens elsewhere. So in Burma and Thailand, Cambodia. But I started developing a love now for Muslim brothers and sisters that are out there, that I now realize the love that I've developed for an Israeli, I don't have to choose not to love people in Iraq or Syria or Jordan. And so I have developed a love because I've tried to love those who are lesser, when you were talking about like homeless people. And so if we don't just look at them like those, beggars on the street that are dirtying up our streets, but as human beings. So in your homelessness work, how do you sympathize? How do you work? Because that's a crisis that seems to be getting worse and worse. And people are looking down their noses like, let's just get rid of these camps, but not solving the problem.
That's really why I try to focus is on solving the problem. And I think you had a really good, when you were talking about, people see one thing and then they sort it, right, based on a two-dimensional scale, right? Yes. It's either this or that. And so in Our Broken America, I talk about how we need to really rethink that and think about yes and. So that because life is much more complex, just like you just mentioned, that I think people often think about. And then, but that's the way life really is. Life is not simple and sorting and clear. It's very complex, which is what makes it interesting. But in my work with Our House, which is a homeless shelter that works with newborn babies and their families, it's a real process. And one of the things I love about Our House is that when we, they're our clients, and when our clients come in, the first thing we do is figure out why they're homeless, because there's a reason they're homeless. And it sounds so obvious, but if you don't know why they ended up homeless, you can't figure out how to fix it. And so that's where we start in the process. And then our entire journey with the client is to figure out how to bridge the gap so that they can, our goal is a self-sufficient family for every child. So it's help the mother and baby. It's either job, education, or training. It's making sure they have all the paperwork done if they're, if they have any government services. It's connecting them to the right other nonprofit that might help them with job placement or follow up or a reduced, rent apartment. So it's all those things that kind of, make things work. And quite often, these are families that either there was an abusive situation and they left, or they were fired from a job, or they got a medical issue, or something happened that got them off track. And so we really try to figure out, how can we help them get back on track? And what I've really found is that when you talk to these people that are experiencing homelessness and you treat them with respect, you can learn so much from them. And one of the ladies told me, she goes, I had never thought about myself as a learner or be able to do anything, but coming to this program, she actually got an early childhood education certificate so she can now teach. Mm. And she's like, it's changed my life because now I understand that I have value too. Yes. And that I now have skills that I can help other people. It's a wonderful process.
Well, I love the fact that you're listening to their story. And I feel like that's so much of what we want to talk about a little bit today. And for our listeners, I'm sorry, I have a cold. My voice might be in and out a little bit. But one thing I posted on our Instagram is that it's difficult to hate someone from up close. If you want to love harder, get closer. And I feel like it's hate or it's dislike or it's not understanding their situation. When we just get closer, it's so much easier to love harder, because when we're spending that time listening to their story, listening to their heart, is that it's difficult to hate someone from up close. If you want to love harder, get closer. And I feel like it's hate or it's dislike or it's not understanding their situation. When we just get closer, it's so much easier to love harder, because when we're spending that time listening to their story, listening to their heart, just like Jesus did throughout the Bible, he stopped what he was doing and communicated and talked with people, even if they were in sin, even if they were against him. He took time. And Proverbs 18:13 says, to answer before listening, that is folly and shame. And so for us, it seems like the art of listening has just been lost on our society, especially in regards to a political standpoint. So can you share a little bit about the biblical importance of listening well and how this can impact our generation and just our culture as a whole?
I think you raised a really good point. And I think so often, we don't listen because not only do we have our own set beliefs, but we're already judging someone, right? Before we even get to know them. And from a biblical perspective, and I think we're often told, to not judge, but to be humble, right? Mm-hmm. To not be haughty in mind or so, but to really try to love your neighbor as yourself, and even love your enemy. And you can't love your enemy nor your neighbor if you're constantly judging them. Mm-hmm. And so for me, if you really think about the spectrum of, if our goal is love, which I think obviously from a biblical standpoint, it should be, which doesn't always mean that you approve of everything that the other person does. Because again, I love my children, my two children. That does not mean that I approve of everything that they do.
Right.
Nor does that mean that I don't, have discussions with them about things that they should or should not do. It just means that I love them regardless, right? So without, it's not dependent on what they do. It's just love. So to me, the judgment, which is what we so often fall into especially on the political side, is kind of the opposite of that, because we're already determining, right, whether someone is good or bad mm-hmm. without really knowing them. And that judgment also makes them feel like they're less valuable. Which, if we believe in the Bible that we're all, right, created. That God's in all of us and that we're all God's creation, one person isn't better than the other. So I think there are a lot of things that we can draw from the biblical side, but I think it's very hard on the political arena because, as you mentioned earlier, Lenya, the proximity, the being close to people is so important, that you learn to love not only, people, the Jewish people, but also Muslims and others, is that 64% of Democrats and 55% of Republicans have few or no friends in the opposite party.
Mm. So that's a problem.
Right. So if 65% of Democrats and 55% of Republicans have few or no friends in the opposite party, then it makes it really easy to judge and not love.
Mm-hmm. Because you just don't have that wide scope of understanding of where they're coming from. And we see that so much in debates and in discussions, and it's almost as if our culture is obsessed with debating, that it's become something where they want to debate, but they've already made up their minds. You address this in your book, Our Broken America. So can you share the premise of that to our listeners and explain which cultural changes have contributed to this divisiveness? Why are people so heated about this? Has this always been this way? Is this new?
That's a great question. So in Our Broken America, I start with kind of the how do we get here? And so for history, clearly this isn't the most divided we've ever been. I mean, we were obviously more divided during the Civil War. We actually, declared war on sides of
ourselves,
of the country. So that was a more divisive time. And you can actually, I talk about that in Our Broken America about how that, what led up to that and what you could see happening. But clearly things have accelerated kind of where we are. I mean, one is, the news changing from news. When I was young, it was news delivered straight to a screen on TV or in a paper, at a certain time of day. And it was much more information and factual than it was opinion. And now we have not only 24-hour-a-day news, but we have 24-hour-a-day cable channels that are much more, on both sides, are much more opinion driven than they are fact driven. And so if you think about their business model, they have to grab viewers, and you don't grab viewers by sitting down and having a nice heart-to-heart discussion. What I've also found out during my research for Our Broken America is that the way our human brains work is that when we express rage, it actually drives more rage. So I call it this outrageous outrage. And I mean, even think about the last personal interaction you had, whether it's with your, friend, a child, a spouse, whoever. But once you start down that path, it's almost like, you can't help yourself. You become outrageously outraged, and it's ongoing. So in some ways, I think about and then you have social media. So not only can I see cable channels 24 hours a day, but now I can sit in my bed at 3 a.m, right? And I can tweet something nasty about somebody that I don't even know.
Right.
So there are a lot of things that I think have contributed to that. But I don't want to focus on, blaming or what's happened. I mean, I think it's important to understand what's happened, but instead of blaming, I think we need to figure out, the only way to fix it really is for everyone to take responsibility and be a leader in their own community. And it's hard. It's hard work.
I love that. What you're talking about really is a scapegoat, that this polarization leads to demonization. And so the scapegoat happens, or there's litmus test, comes up, and what you believe on these things puts you in this category so that you can become less human and more of, just a thing to hate.
Yeah.
And so I think that one thing you're talking about is getting to know other people from different backgrounds, and that takes intentionality. You have to really be intentional to do that because it doesn't necessarily happen naturally. So it's really important that you are. And then, of course, like you're saying, to come with this idea of respect and honor, and which we used to have a lot more of respect and honor in our society. If we can put that back in. I remember once being on a plane, and a gal was sitting next to me that was clearly in transition with her gender identity. And she was wearing that like a badge. I mean, it was very obvious that she wanted attention for where she was in that space. And so I just turned to her and I said, so are you pan? Are you trans? Are you, help me understand what's going on there. And I think she was so surprised that I just dove in and then asked legit questions. So then she started explaining to me where she was in her life and where she was going. Turns out she was a really neat Jewish gal that had been raised in a home. And as we started having conversation, that's when she kind of realized that I was an evangelical, and she wanted to recoil. But by then we were in this respectful exchange, and she goes, gosh, I really didn't expect I would be having a conversation with someone like you, And so then the conversation just continued to progress respectfully. And so she finally, just kind of asked questions that, maybe she, from her side, what does an evangelical think about this and why? And when you can have a reasoned response, and you can go through and explain things, she just kept saying to me, well, I never thought of it like that. Well, I never thought of it like that. And by the end of it, I would say, I'm not saying we were besties, but we went through this entire conversation without hostility, without name calling ad hominem, anything else. and exchanged each other's Instagram accounts, and for a while would, make comments on each other's account. Now, so that's just one of those situations where I couldn't be with anyone more different than my upbringing or understanding, and I'm sure she was too. But we were able to have discourse.
But I would love to talk about that a little bit, because we had mentioned judgment. We're called not to be haughty. We're called not to be prideful, not to be judgmental. So what does that look like? I think I can imagine listeners thinking, okay, but what's the balance then? What's the balance of knowing what I believe biblically to be true while continuing to love these people? And for me, I believe there's a point of bearing fruit. It's the sin, not the sinner. So we look at the people as a whole and we say they all have their own stories, just like Jackie was talking about, just like Lenya was talking about with the airplane. They all have their own stories to listen to. We are not called to judge their situation. We are called to share truth in love and to speak in love. And that does not mean debating with aggression and with anger and with rage, and to have a desire for them to see Jesus out of it, not to see that we are right. And I think that's where sometimes we get so confused, and where the non-Christian world says, you're so judgmental, you're so opinionated. But if we are able to express those thoughts with graciousness and with compassion and with a desire to understand their heart, it completely changes the dynamic of the conversation.
I think that's a great point. And so often I think conversations go off rails so quickly because there's an automatic assumption of they're different than me, whether it's politics or something else. Therefore, they're not going to like me. Therefore, they're going to be hostile to me. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and be hostile before they can be hostile because I don't want to be hurt.
Yeah.
Right. And so people walk in with this preconceived notion of we have to go to battle because that's the only way that we can exist. And I think it takes a lot of personal courage and a lot of being very self-aware and self-assured in your own beliefs to be able to put them on hold, like Lenya was talking about, to be able to not be the one out in front, and to be able to listen first before you offer your opinion.
Yeah.
But that's really the only way, if you can only control one side of right, you can't control both sides of the conversation. You can only control the one that you're in control of, which is yourself. And so the way you do that is you have to do that by leading, like Lenya mentioned, is to be curious, to ask questions, to being open to learn about that person, to being non-judgmental, which I think is really hard for people, just because of human nature. It's what we do all day long, right? We judge, people by the way they look, by the cars they drive, by the churches they go to or don't go to. So I think it really takes a lot of effort to kind of slow down, understand, where you are where I am with God, and to have the confidence to be able to listen to somebody else.
Yeah. And I think also it takes an evaluation of your own heart, because you may be seeing their life, what you see to be this massive sin or something that they're doing that isn't biblical, even if they're not claiming to be a Christian. But it's external, like you're seeing these external sins. But when I find myself, because I would be lying if I said it wasn't a struggle sometimes, when I see someone living a certain way and just think, what are you doing? But it takes 2 seconds for me to look inward and to evaluate myself by God's word and realize, well, I was just prideful, and God hates pride, and I am selfish, and I struggle with so many different things, that when we have that view and that perspective of I am broken, they are broken, there is nothing different about our brokenness aside from how we express it and the fact that I am saved by grace. And I think that just shifts the dynamic to where you just say, for me, what would I be without God's grace? I have no idea where I would be. I would probably be a huge mess, but God saved me. And that was because of someone's willingness to share the love of Jesus with me, to listen to my story without judgment, and just to pour grace upon me and show me the forgiveness of Christ. And I just feel like it allows us to see things so much more clearly when we're willing to look inward.
Well, if you look at Jesus, he was the king of responding in the opposite.
I love that.
Yes.
Yeah. He's strategic with his words.
People would say to him, he has tax collectors, sinners. If he just knew that woman at his feet, was a scarlet lettered woman, and how could he let that happen? And he's all wine bibbers and drunkards, that's what they would say. And Jesus' harshest criticisms were for the Pharisees, Sadducees, the religious people.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just looking at the people as a sheep without a shepherd. And so he had sympathy, he had compassion, it said, because they don't have a shepherd. So just like on the homelessness issue with you, Jackie, when you look at these people, they're sheep without a shepherd. Something happened. There was not, whether it was the father, the education, the financial situation, whatever it was, they didn't have someone to care for them. And when you come in with genuine care and shepherd someone through a situation, then you're responding that opposite spirit. And so Jesus, of course, he said, you're talking about outrageous rage, or I don't know how you put it, but Jesus said, turn the other cheek. If someone compels you to go 1 mile, go 2. If someone asks for your cloak, give them your coat. That Jesus lived differently.
Mm-hmm.
We have a counterintuitive, upside down kingdom where the meek are the strong ones, where the weak, the things that are lesser, the poor, God puts value on that over those that are. So I think as Christians, as we're walking, and what I'm seeing you say, not just on a personal level, of course, Jackie, it does, but you're saying if we do this collectively, if we could collectively as a society do this, that's why we love, someone in a church when they'll stand up and take a bullet or do something, because they're going against the opposite spirit. So I think, Jackie, that you're kind of calling out to the better angels of our nature, if you will, and asking a whole lot of us to look at this differently.
I'm challenging us all. I mean, I recently went to Korea, and I've never been to Asia before. And it reminded me how big the world is.
Yes.
And, half the world's population lives in Asia. I've traveled to other places, but never somewhere where I didn't even understand the characters in the words, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a totally different situation. And it made me very grateful for our country, because we have a lot of freedoms that other countries don't have. And it reminds me that, our country was founded on the belief that God gave individuals rights and that we loaned them to the government. But what that means is for us to really work properly is just what you said, is the citizens have to be really involved. And not just in, voting occasionally, but also in how we organize as a community and as a country. So I talk a lot about in Our Broken America that we really need to start from a place of gratefulness. And we should be grateful. I'm incredibly grateful that I live in a country where we're allowed to have political discussions about policy.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are many places where you can't do that. So if you can kind of step back, if you're in that world, if you can kind of step back and say, gosh, this is great. We even have the chance to do this. And if we have the chance and the opportunity, shouldn't we do it the right way? Which is we should listen to each other and see what we can learn. Because part of that challenge, too, is if you listen to the opposite side, you could either A, learn something about them, which would be great. B, you might learn that some of the information they had wasn't correct, and you could then talk about that. Or C, you may actually change your position on where you stand. But all of those are a way in which we can make progress together. And I think, unfortunately, we've gotten this pattern of yelling about problems, but yelling about problems doesn't fix problems. Working together fixes problems.
Yeah. Yeah. And how would you say this is dangerous to our country? The fact that we are where we are, how is this dangerous to our country, and what is a solution?
I think it is dangerous. I think it's dangerous because I think it's very easy for anyone to get up in the middle of the night, to pull out Twitter and to tweet something nasty about somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sad and too bad. So I think it's very dangerous because every time that happens, it pulls the two sides apart.
Yeah.
And it makes it harder to actually work together and make progress. And as we all know, if you get into a cycle where you can't make progress together, then you eventually pull back to your corners. I mean, this happens in families and couples and friendships in a lot of different places. So you each then, you pull even farther away and make even less progress. So I think it's a real problem. I think how we fix it is we have to do it with active citizens, and we have to do it on the community level. So for me, I'm really involved in, as I mentioned, 4 nonprofits. One is Georgia Early Education Alliance for Ready Students, and we work with birth through 5 to make sure that they have access to high quality education. I work with financial literacy, the Trust for Public Land, as well as Our House, which is a homeless shelter. So for me, getting really involved in something I care about those things. And then we've made progress in each of those areas. We've helped homeless people, we've saved land for people, etc. I now have friends on the opposite side of the political spectrum who not only work with me on those problems, but actually are friends of mine, and we like each other. So when something else happens, I have someone to call and talk to. And we've also worked with these same people on other issues that are important politically. So I think the only way to do it is really to reach out. It takes effort to find something you care about, and then to work with anyone who's interested in that project together to make progress.
I love the example of that. And what you're making me think of, well, first of all, JFK, ask not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And so really, he was trying to say, be more involved, this volunteerism and this idea that we all can contribute. And so I think that's, to be a good citizen, you need to be an engaged citizen, an active citizen contributing. Right. And the more we try and raise our children to be good citizens, number one, and then contributing citizens, not takers, givers. And all of us can give in some way. We can't always give financially, but we can give of our time, of our energy, resources in another way. So I really do believe that people should be volunteering in some capacity in their lives. So I think that's beautiful. The other thing that I thought was interesting in what you said is that we should be building bridges, not burning bridges. And people are so busy burning these bridges instead of building them. And so when you build this bridge, whether in your community, people may think homelessness is a Democratic issue for Democrats and not Republican. But when you cross over, you make friends on that other situation, and they're like, oh, we do have common ground. We can unite to do this thing. And so instead of grabbing an issue, if we can agree on common ground and build that bridge. And the other thought I had about this is, don't you just love the ex-president's club? When you saw Clinton and Bush Jr. and Sr. getting together and tackling issues together, or you see, Bush Jr. sitting next to Michelle Obama and giving her a mint and them giggling, and then seeing them work on projects that show the country, look, we can work together. I have had more joy when I've seen the camaraderie of this ex-president's club is what it is. And so I just am longing for more leaders to lead like that. The more you see people lead like that, the more their followers in whatever format will follow that. They'll continue to say, oh, look, Obama did that. Why can't we? Oh, look, how did your dad, when he was Speaker of the House and the season that he was in Congress, how did he create the contract with America? I mean, at that time, wasn't there polarization and weren't there different parties involved that he was able to push through legislation that he found people across the aisle that would, work and agree on something?
It was I'm going to break it into 2 different sections.
Okay.
The contract with America, I mean, the great thing about the contract with America, it was all forward-looking, positive things that could be accomplished. It wasn't a grand vision that, we'll all have, the best health ever, right? So it was specific steps that were clearly defined and were actually printed at that time in the Reader's Digest, right? So that's how long ago this was. It wasn't on social media. It was in the Reader's Digest, but it was put in there as a pullout so that people could tear it out and literally check the boxes to the right as the items were accomplished. So to me, that's the best way to run a campaign, because you can, it's clear, it's defined, it's they're finite, they're not, these huge things. And so that's what the contract with America was. And they did vote on everything that was in the contract in the days. I think it was 100 days. I could be wrong, whatever that time frame was. So that was, I think, a very clear message. It was rolled out in the fall. It was very rapidly done. and led to the Republicans taking over the House. Now, interestingly enough, he was Speaker when President Bill Clinton was in office.
That's right.
And clearly they had different political parties.
Sure.
But they both understood that the country needed them to work together to get some things done. And I don't know if you remember, but there were several times during the process of the budget that the budget shut down.
Yes.
And my dad bore the brunt of most of that, which I think he's like, whatever, he had to be done. But in the end, they did work together and they did create a balanced budget for 4 years. It's the only time in my lifetime, literally in my lifetime, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, that we've had a balanced budget as a nation. So, it wasn't easy, it wasn't pretty, but what they both understood is that to do this, you had to sit in the same room, you had to talk to each other, and you had to figure out what things does one person have to have, and what does the other person have to have, and which are negotiable, and to finally make those things happen. So it just takes a lot of work, and I think, unfortunately, today, it's too easy for both sides to pull back, to not be in proximity with one another, and to call each other names in an attempt to raise money and to raise the pitch of the environment. But unfortunately, that doesn't help our country.
On the other end of the spectrum, that makes me think about the silence of it. There are people who they will rage, or there are people who just aren't going to communicate about politics at all because they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to be involved in the issues. They don't like confrontation. What is your advice to people who feel that way? I have so many friends and family members who, even in a normal, calm conversation, it's just an immediate, I don't go there. I don't talk about politics. I'm done. Walk out of the room type of thing, because they won't even get invested or allow themselves to consider the importance of politics in our world. What would you say to those people who are maybe too silent about it all?
Yeah. Well, so a couple of things. First, in any population, whether it's citizens of a country or people in a school, you're going to have a curve of where people feel comfortable, right? So you're going to have some people, quite frankly, that it's very hard for them to do this. What I can tell you is that if you decide it's important enough, either for you as a person, your family, your religion, if you believe that this is something that you're called, that God wants us to do, is to love our enemies and talk to them, or for whatever reason, then anyone can learn how to do this. I mean, I was telling my son last night, he was talking about learning something, and I said, so when I was in college, I took a public speaking course, and I was so terrified that I could not even stand up in front of a room of 12 people and give a speech. Okay, so now I've been on national TV dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and I've done speeches to as big of a crowd of 5,000 people. So clearly I learned how to get over that fear and how to perform as a speaker. So my point is, anyone can learn how to do something if they care enough to go through the process and to understand that it's not going to be easy. Nothing that you learn is easy. Right. It's just a process you decide is important enough to do it.
I think Jesus said something that maybe helps this for a person who's disengaged. Mm-hmm. Jesus said, if you're not for me, you're against me. Mm-hmm. And so you think you have the luxury of being neutral, but I don't think you do. Neutral, or being silent during Nazi Germany, is why Germany fell.
Right.
Right? Too many people were silent, that they thought they won't get involved. They're not going to be a part of this. And it was a crime against humanity. Mm-hmm. And so in some issues, it may be life and death. Yeah. You know what I mean? I don't think you have the luxury to not get involved. Yeah. And then kind of going back to, having this truth with America, our broken America, if you're not in fixing it, you're still broken, mm-hmm. right? I mean, we all have to work toward a solution in whatever way. And so when she was talking about her dad and the contract with America and working with Bill Clinton and coming together and saying, what are the core issues? What are the we aren't just going to, there'll be, but when we compromise, everyone wins. Mm. It is a compromise. You're not going to get everything that's on your, list, but the nation wins when we do. Mm-hmm. When we finally have Congress, Senate, everybody working toward, let's solve the immigration issue. it's a win.
Mm-hmm.
The longer we keep it as something that is polarizing or is a wedge issue, we're not winning.
Yeah.
And so eventually we do have to come to the table, and someone's got to compromise, and somebody's got to step up to the plate like your father did or Bill Clinton did. And those are men from opposite sides. But they finally said that the greater goal, the greater is for the nation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and when we put something greater than ourselves and our little fiefdoms, you know, and that's what I also really loved about what you said, because I do travel a lot, Jackie. Your book talks about tribalism. And I don't know how many people will come to me because I go to Iraq and Jordan and Israel. So I've traveled a lot. I have been to Saudi Arabia, which was amazing. That got to meet the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And to go to these places and to be so different than where I am, you know what I mean? And obviously in Saudi Arabia, there is not a lot of public discourse. You don't really speak poorly about the king. So, you know, the gratefulness for being where we are. But people will say to me, what do you think the problem is in the Middle East? And I said, well, what I think people paint over as a brush when they're not on the ground meeting people is tribalism. You look at it differently than it really is. When you have Yazidis and Kurds and Sunni and Shia and Wahhabism and all these different influences, and you stay in your little fiefdom clumps of tribe, it is very difficult to come to a solution. And my fear, and I think what you have in your book, Jackie, is that there's the fear of us as a nation becoming tribalistic.
Absolutely. I do talk about tribalism. And interestingly enough, we have become not only more polarized from an ideological standpoint, so both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, have kind of pulled away from the middle from an ideology standpoint in terms of what they believe in political policies. But the other thing that we've done is we've become much more tribal in terms of the parties. I think part of this is the news cycles. I think part of this is we now identify parties based on not only names but also colors.
Yes.
So I call it the sportification of politics. That it's no longer just something that you do when you go vote, but now it's a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, 365 or 366 this year, days a week label that is identified by color. And that didn't happen until the Bush-Gore election and the recount in Florida. That was the first time in our history that on TV you had the same color for the same party on every news station. And then we saw it every day for weeks. And so I think what's happened, and the research actually proves this, is that people are much more judgmental about parties even before they meet someone. So they don't know who you are and they don't know anything about you. But if they know what party you belong to and it's not yours, then you know you don't like them.
Exactly. Well, I think you didn't get a job based on that, didn't you? Because of your father?
Well, that was my sister, yes.
Oh, so your sister.
My sister did not, yes. My sister Kathy did not get a job because of who our father, and I've had things like that happen to me as well, because people have very preconceived notions, or the opposite is they don't want to run the risk of having me associated with their business because, gosh, that might be confrontational or might create some controversy.
You'll taint their brand.
Exactly.
So in chapter 5 of your book, it says the Great Seal of the United States, which is used to authenticate some federal documents, includes the Latin phrase e pluribus unum, which means out of the many, one. This signifies the unity of the states under a federal government. While we came from different places and might eat different foods or dress in different ways, we have long recognized that we are, at our core, Americans. And the more that we do identity politics and we move into these clumps, then we are not becoming one. And the whole American experiment was, that refugees came over, whether they were Jewish or Irish or, the great American experiment was this melting pot where, out of the many, we made this one. But it feels this tribalism, as I'm trying to explain maybe to our listeners, is when we faction and fraction into these groups that only people like me can be in this group. And what I need is the most important thing. Or I will not tolerate the people from the other group because they may take away some of the mojo that I need to get what I need for my group. Am I explaining tribalism
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's hard because a lot of the things that we hear, especially in the political arena, are putting people in categories, right?
Yes.
And talking about if you're this, right, then you must be that, or if you're that, you might be this. And again, that gets back to our earlier discussion about that life is really much more complex than that. And so, it shouldn't. I mean, I am involved in homelessness, but it's, to me, it's kind of sad that people say, "Oh my gosh, you're involved in homelessness and you're a Republican." Well, I mean, a lot of Republicans are. You know what I'm saying? Like, of course, like it doesn't. You don't have to be one thing. You don't have to be the other. We're not
That's right.
as simple as people try to make us out to be, anyone. And I think, to your point, what we really need to do is focus on the values that we believe in. I mean, do you believe, like I said, do you believe that God gives rights to individuals, like our founding documents say, and that
Yes.
that we're supposed to then, right, loan them to the government and make sure the government protects us, and to keep them in check. But I think there's some foundational values that we need to have discussions about. But one of the things America's always believed in, it happened all during our founding, is the ability to have, I would call it discourse and dialogue, or passionate discussions, or be able to really talk about hard things. And to me, that's the real challenge of tribalism, because if you're busy hating the other side before you talk to them, you never get the chance to have that interaction and that dialogue that really can, if done properly, lead us to a better place.
So good. I really love the idea of that and the understanding, and even celebrating, the different cultures. And I don't mind. I like diversity.
Yeah.
There I said it,
Yeah.
And so many of the things that I feel like if I want to come out and say that now I'm, ambiguous, or even slap back, as a pastor's wife. If I make some of these comments, I can guarantee someone said, "Oh my gosh, she sat next to a transsexual. Did she tell him the truth? Did she preach the gospel? Did she just sit there and love? Is love the only answer?"
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I can already feel the slap back in the other way. Of course, we always speak the truth in love. And but the point is, there is love and there is speaking the truth, and how to, the velvet glove, so to speak.
Yeah.
So.
And when you go back to being for Jesus, like we were talking about earlier, it is difficult to look away from politics and the importance of having these conversations with people, the importance of allowing ourselves to go there, because God has called us to be his ambassadors for the orphans, for the widows, for the unborn, for the homeless. And if we are not having these conversations, then we are turning our eyes away from it. And so in your book, Jackie, I just love that you're allowing us to see how we can have these conversations without ranting or becoming angry, but through the act of listening and compassion and understanding. So my last question would just be, what do you hope that people gain after reading your book?
So what I would hope after reading Our Broken America, that people would be more likely to, or willing to, right, take the risk, because it is risky, to get into these discussions with people that are different from them. Not only, I mean, whether it's politically or, I mean, in different perspectives, but to really understand that, part of why we judge as human beings is because it makes us feel better, right? And
About
again,
ourselves,
according to the Bible, this is a sin, right? Because if I'm judging you, that I'm saying I'm better than you, right? And so there's a lot to think about. And so I really hope that people think about, what's driving me to be so judgmental? Why do I feel like I can't listen? And do I not understand what I believe well enough to feel secure enough to have these hard conversations? So it's not a one-time thing. I think it's a process, to really think about how you can not only, listen to others, but, as you said earlier, love your enemies. It doesn't mean that you agree with everything somebody says. It doesn't mean you agree with everything that someone does. But it does mean that when you walk in the door, you don't start screaming at people. Yeah. And I think it makes a huge difference, not only for, I think you'll find your personal life is better. And I think you'll also begin to understand that you'll learn a lot about the people around, and begin to learn how that together we really can make our country great.
Jackie, I have loved getting to know you. I hope that this isn't our only encounter. I pray that the Lord opens doors for us to be able to hang out, partner, whatever God has
have
in
some
the
coffee.
future. Yeah, whatever it is. Maybe we can get you out here and speak to our women sometime.
That would be awesome.
Something like that. But anyway, you're just a treasure. You're a jewel.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Jackie. We enjoyed having you on.
You're welcome. I love being on. And Lenya, I really feel like I was so blessed to be on Huckabee's show and have the opportunity to meet you. So thank you for coming out there And thank you for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
God bless you.
For behind-the-scenes videos and photos, as well as info about our upcoming guests, follow along with us on Instagram at allthethings.podcast. You can keep up with Lenya at Lenya Heitzig and Lindsey at lindsey.maestas. If you'd like to listen to past episodes or learn more about us, visit the allthethingspodcast.com.